Welcome to the Bible Feed podcast, a place for conversations about the Bible and faith in the modern world, where ordinary people come together to help each other understand the Bible better. Let's get started.
Welcome to the Bible Feed podcast. I'm Laurence Davenport, and I'm here with Paul Davenport.
Hi, Laurence. Good to be here.
Hi, Paul. This is going to be one of those episodes, isn't it? So, in view of the fact that it's movie season at the moment with the Oscars, etc., we're going to title this episode "Soul." So, I presume, Paul, that we're going to use this episode to talk about music. Is that right?
Oh, is that what we're doing? Okay, we might have taken a wrong turn there then, or we'll just have a very, very short podcast.
I think that could well be the case. I'm no music expert, definitely not an expert on soul. So I wondered why you asked me to host this one.
I think the idea of two middle-aged white men talking about an African-American music genre, that's not going to go well.
It's a recipe for disaster.
I'll tell you what we could do, though. I'm sure we all know some good songs. So why don't we set ourselves a challenge of dropping some song titles into our conversation?
Okay, I respect that.
And we obviously won't make it too easy for our listeners to spot them
with air quotes or anything. Okay, good. So we're not talking about music. We've established that. That's good. That's behind us. So what is it that we are talking about?
Well, we are going to talk about the soul, and by that we mean the soul as you might think it appears in the Bible, and we're going to get underneath the biblical meaning of that word. You know, obviously when we're reading our Bibles, you and I, Laurence, tend to read it in English, but the original text is Hebrew and Greek. But we read this English word soul in our Bibles, and the problem is that there's quite a bit of baggage that comes with that word. So the English word, that is, which means it doesn't necessarily represent very well what the original Hebrew and Greek words had behind them and the meaning that they were trying to convey.
Yeah, so I mean, we come from a fairly well-established sort of Christian background, both of us, and we even with our backgrounds, we kind of know what that cultural meaning behind the word soul is. It's and you know, it's the immaterial part of the person, the thing that kind of lives on, etc. So is that what the Bible is teaching us?
Yeah, but that idea about a immaterial part of a person that is sort of trapped inside a body, and at death it's released from its prison in its fleshly body and does something else, goes somewhere else. You know, that's really something that comes from Greek ideas, and maybe even earlier than that, Egyptian. In fact, Plato talks about, I think it's in his dialogue called Republic, he talks about there being a fixed number of souls. You know, it's immortal, it's there forever. You never get more of them, you never get fewer of them. That was his perspective. That's
very interesting. That's almost like the physics idea of energy and like a fixed amount of energy. And
yeah,
there you go.
Conservation, the law of conservation of souls.
Yeah, and I think it's not just the school of Plato. I think it was the Stoicism as well, which also had an idea of the soul, which was related to their view of logos, which actually is interesting because logos is an idea, that a word that appears, the word. In fact, we had an entire session on it, didn't we, recently?
We did, fairly recently.
Yeah,
thinking about the Trinity.
And so they have this idea of the soul being something that can be destroyed, actually. So they've got different views, again, just within Greek philosophy.
But it's a sort of thing that you would associate with Christianity as an immortal soul that goes somewhere. But for Christians who start to explore, you know, why they believe what they believe, or where what they have been taught has come from, will start to pick away at that meaning and realize that it perhaps doesn't come from the Bible in the way that you might think it does. And it's one of the big steps that people tend to take fairly early on in examining their faith and sort of deconstructing it a bit and putting it back together. You know, and that's never an easy thing to do. It can be a hard and an emotional, you know, stressful time for people to think about their faith and kind of pick it apart and realize it was perhaps not quite so based on the Bible as they thought. But this idea of the soul and getting back to the biblical meaning is a real important step in that difficult process.
I second that emotion, definitely. And how do we do that? You know, so we've probably both been through periods where we've, questioned, certain topics and delved into scripture. We've got our own way of doing that. But how would you recommend somebody looking into this topic, getting the most out of it and getting to the kind of core of what it is?
Yeah. So as I said, we've got to get to what the underlying Hebrew and Greek words are about and what they mean. We'll perhaps take a look at the Hebrew to start with. And these days we've got readily available tools to get to the original Hebrew words and get to what they mean. So lexicons and so on, and search engines of the Bible. So in Hebrew, the word that might be translated soul in the Old Testament is the Hebrew word nephesh, and that it's actually a really common word. It appears 728 times, a few statistics, but 728 times in the Old Testament. So that's quite a lot. And it appears in 31 out of the 39 books. So it's pretty widespread. But if you look at the meaning, let's see what you make of this. So in the Hebrew Aramaic lexicon, this is the list of meanings that come with nephesh. So it starts with throat, then neck, breath, living being, people, personality, oneself, or life. It also adds soul, but then the final one on the list is dead soul. So what do you make of that list of things? What kind of thing does that convey?
Well,
what nephesh might mean.
So it's really interesting, actually. So almost as you were reading through them, it was taking me through like the physical process of breath to then an allegorical sort of version of that, kind of what could that mean on a kind of spiritual level. So it's quite interesting as you read through that.
And I wonder whether in some of these ancient languages, the origins of words start with very kind of basic physical meanings. The throat, the neck, part of the body in which breath goes in and out, food goes in and out. It's fundamental to being a living being, living, breathing creature. Yeah, and therefore it comes by extension to mean more figuratively being a person, life, personality, and so on.
Kind of human experience, then, isn't it? It's kind of going from like the hierarchy of needs, from like the the basic, indeed,
bit of Maslow.
So the basic requirements for life into maybe a more civilized society where it's takes on a more spiritual meaning. But okay, that's fine. So we've looked at that. I mean, I'm not a Hebrew scholar, and I don't believe you are, Paul, unless you're hiding it.
Definitely not.
So from that theoretical kind of view of just that single word, maybe we could pop that into context and have a look at some examples. Maybe that's a good way of doing it.
Yeah, and we can see it appearing, a number of those different meanings that I read out there appearing. So there's a psalm, which is quite well known, Psalm 69. It's a psalm of David. So I'll just read the first verse, which says, "Save me, O God, for the waters have come up to my neck." That's the English Standard Version. And neck is nephesh. So that's what it means. But you see it used in all sorts of different circumstances about people. So, for example, at the beginning of the book of Exodus, Genesis is closed with Joseph, and then Exodus is about the people of the Israelites in Egypt. And it says the family is 70. The family of Israel in Egypt is 70 people, 70 persons. And that's the word nephesh, so just people. And you're probably familiar with some of the aspects of the law of Moses, where certain things make the priests or people unclean, touching a dead body in Leviticus 21, for example. So a dead nephesh in that case.
Oh, is that where that one appears? The dead bodies?
Yeah. So that's Leviticus 21, verse 11.
Okay.
If you want to check that out. So some of those basic meanings, and they all to do with people. But perhaps we'll spend a little bit more time looking at Genesis chapter 2 and look at a couple of verses there, because this sort of gives us the foundation of where we're going to build on the biblical meaning of this. So in Genesis chapter 2, we have the sort of second part of the creation narrative. And in Genesis chapter 2, verse 7, we read, "Then the Lord God formed the man of dust from the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living creature." So that's the English Standard Version. Now, I think the King James Version and other versions says man became a living soul. Yeah. But as soon as you have it in English in that way, it conjures up all of the other ideas that are attached to the word soul. Yeah. But in the English Standard Version, it's translated as creature, nephesh, a living nephesh. And actually, it's the same word appears in verse 19 Now out of the ground the Lord God had formed every beast of the field and every bird of the heavens, and brought them to the man to see what he would call them. And whatever the man called every living creature, that was its name. So every living creature, that's the same. So all of the animals and birds are also living nephesh.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I'm reading the ESV as well, and they've made that choice to use the word creature there.
Yeah, and it's consistent in the English there.
Yeah.
Which is a better reflection, I think, of the Hebrew that underpins it.
Yeah, and you do get other ideas elsewhere in Scripture about the almost like the parity between the life and death of humans and animals, don't you? You get this kind of similarity between them, and I think there's something in Ecclesiastes, I think, about the similarity between the life of a human, the life of an animal, both going to the grave, essentially, both going down into dust. I think it's Ecclesiastes 3, if I remember rightly.
Yeah, I think it is. We can have a look at that if you want.
Yeah, have a quick look at that. So Ecclesiastes 3, and then towards the end of that chapter, it's in fact, very usefully in the ESV, there's a whole subtitle which is From Dust to Dust, which is very useful. But then you've got this section from verse 16, which is about I saw under the sun a place of justice, wickedness, and then towards verse 19, for what happens to the children of man and what happens to the beasts is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. They all have the same breath, and man has no advantage over the beasts, for all his vanity. So you get that similar idea, and then you've got So it's very consistent there with the idea in Genesis 2 there that you saw the same words being used for that creation event of man and the creation event for animals.
And actually, just a couple of verses on from that, I think you read to verse 19.
Correct.
20. Yeah. So 21 asks this question: who knows whether the spirit of man goes upward and the spirit of the beast goes down into the earth? So it poses that question.
Yeah.
It's almost a rhetorical question, which is, well, who knows? No one knows. So okay.
So looking at those examples, then we've had a look at some of those. I think those Genesis ones are really critical for a very early usage of that idea of that word of soul. But to me, this Hebrew is kind of moving us towards generically life and life being given, and then all the way through to like the human experience, because the word soul is used like the soul that sinneth and things like souls that hunger and souls that thirst. We get those references as well, don't we? So that's like everything that's built up around the human experience. So we don't get a strong indication from that of something beyond that idea. And if we were doing an honest reading of those passages, we don't get anything that kind of takes us beyond that meaning in the Hebrew, at least.
We certainly don't get an idea that there are two things, a body and a soul, and they're two separate things that have existence and life separately. The soul, the nephesh, is the whole person, is everything that there is about the person.
Yeah. Okay. So, you mentioned that the New Testament is not written in Hebrew; it's Greek. So we'll have to deal with a whole other set of words, or a word potentially. So, what's soul in Greek?
Yeah, when we get to the New Testament, actually in the English, soul doesn't appear so often. I think it's about 40 times in the New Testament. Mm-hmm. But there's this word in the Greek, which is suke, or something like that, and it's psyche, essentially, in its anglicized form. And that appears 106 times. And its meanings are listed as life and life principle and mind and thoughts and feelings, being a person. So it's quite similar ideas to nephesh from the Hebrew, but perhaps a bit more weighted towards the more figurative meanings of mind, thoughts, feelings of a being.
And you mentioned the anglicized version of that, and you can sometimes, we use that word, don't you, psyche, for somebody's way of thinking, the way that they behave, their outlook, etc.
And who they are as a person. And I think that psyche is is probably a pretty good, the way we use that in English is probably a pretty good reflection of that Greek word. Yeah, so we can look at some examples of that. Let's have a look in Matthew chapter 16. So we'll look at a couple of verses here, actually, because the same word appears, this suche appears twice, but it's translated differently across the two verses. So in verse 25, English Standard Version again, says, "For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake shall find it. But what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? Or what shall a man give in return for his soul?" So in verse 25, whoever would save his life, that's psyche, but it's translated life.
Right.
And then it's the same word translated soul in verse 26.
So they're used interchangeably, kind of synonyms of each other in that sense. Yeah.
So, I almost feel myself, when I read that verse 26, because of all of the baggage that's attached to the word soul, you think, oh, that's saying something it's saying something different from just my life now. It just carries so much baggage of meaning with it that even though it is translated life in the previous verse, it's still, you still have to consciously think, okay, it doesn't mean anything different from the person alive.
It's amazing the power of a translator, isn't it? In kind of cementing ideas in your mind. Yeah. Okay. Any others that you want to turn to?
I think the Net Bible translates them both as life in those two verses, the New English translation. Yeah, so another example it's still in Matthew, actually, in Matthew 26. Mm-hmm. And this is talking about Jesus this time. I think he's in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he says, "My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch with me," as with his disciples in the Garden of Gethsemane. So, that there, the idea of psyche, the feelings, the emotions, the state of mind, the stress that Jesus is under at that moment before he's about to be arrested is expressed in that way.
Yeah,
his soul is very sorrowful.
Yeah, so you have that is like the human experience. Then that's the example of him demonstrating emotions in that way. So okay. So having said that about the New Testament, and it's interesting that word psyche is used in that way in Matthew 16, particularly in that interchangeable way. But there is a kind of problematic verse somewhere in the New Testament. I can't put my finger on it necessarily, but it talks about not being, when Jesus says, "Don't be afraid of people who can just kill the body. Be afraid of those who can kill the body and the soul." So does that then mean, or does that indicate that there is actually this twin part of a person? So it's Matthew 10 verse 28. "Fear not them that kill the body, but are not able to kill the soul, but rather fear him which is able to destroy both soul and body in hell." So that would be a problematic passage, wouldn't it, to deal with in this context? That
sounds like there's two separate things, isn't it? There's a body and there's a soul, and they're two different words, and they do mean different things. But I suppose if the question is, does that verse demonstrate that the soul is an indestructible part of a person? Mm-hmm. I think when you read the whole phrase, it's pretty obvious that it isn't saying that the soul is an indestructible thing in the way that Plato would have it. Because it talks about fear that which kills both body, or destroys. I think the word destroy, isn't it? Destroys both body and soul. And actually, they're destroyed in the same way. Both destroy both body and soul in hell, and that's Gehenna, which is often associated with this destruction or a sort of burning of rubbish outside Jerusalem. So it doesn't really appear to, while it does make the distinction between body and soul, and maybe we can come back and think about what that might mean, but it certainly isn't claiming that the soul is an indestructible thing.
Yeah.
It's clearly saying it's destroyed in the same way that a body can be destroyed.
Yeah, that's very important, actually, isn't it? Because one of the fundamental parts of the cultural view of the soul is that it's immortal, and therefore, then what would that mean in that respect? If it can't be destroyed, then why is it saying that? So it must mean something else.
Yeah, and if the soul, if that's the psyche much more associated with who the person is, what makes that individual, their memories, their experiences, the way they think, the way they feel, the way they react. That's a different concept. Jesus is saying, well, that can be remembered and recreated.
Yeah. Okay. So is it kind of, to summarise then that view? Would it be fair to say, a bit like Braveheart, you can take our, I can't remember the exact phrase now, but it's almost like you can take our lives, but you can't take our faith. It's that
freedom.
kind of idea.
Yeah.
Freedom.
Yeah.
That's it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to throw just random, like, difficult passages at you now, Paul. So, which is a good way of testing a theory. So I think it's in Philippians 1 where Paul says about Paul the Apostle. Says that he will be with Jesus when he dies, and so again, is that not another little piece of evidence that supports this cultural view of the soul?
Let's have a look at those.
Philippians 1, I believe, verse 23.
Yeah. Verse 23.
Shall I read those for you?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so Philippians 1, verse 23, again ESV. I am hard pressed between the two. My desire is to depart and be with Christ, for that is far better. But to remain in the flesh is more necessary for your account.
Okay. Yeah, so I think he's in prison when he's writing this, and so he's a bit uncertain about his future, and so he's caught in a dilemma between, if I die, that's good because I will be with Christ. But if I remain alive, that's better for everybody else and the churches that he's ministering to, because he'll be able to continue his work preaching the gospel. I think that's basically what it's saying. But so I think if you come to that verse with the idea that there's some part of us that's called a soul that is immortal and indestructible and must live on at death, mm-hmm. then I can see how you would read that and say, well, that's what Paul is talking about. His soul is going to depart and be with Christ. Mm-hmm. But does that verse say that would happen, that he would be with Christ immediately? I'm not sure it does. It certainly says he would then be with Christ after death. So I guess what we have to do is look, well, is there anywhere else that Paul says how he understands he would be with Christ after he's died? And he says it a few times in this letter, actually. So in this first chapter, earlier in the chapter, verse 6, so he says, I am sure of this, that he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion at the day of Jesus Christ. So and then in chapter 3, at verse 20, he says, our citizenship is in heaven. That's where we belong as citizens. Our citizenship is in heaven. And from heaven, we await the Saviour, the Lord Jesus Christ, who will transform our lowly body to be like his glorious body by the power that enables him even to subject all things to himself. So even just in the verses around that, Paul is saying we're all waiting for the day of Jesus Christ. We're waiting for Jesus to return from heaven. It's the phraseology, the imagery that's used. And then our bodies will be transformed, about resurrection. So just by looking at a few passages around that one that you highlighted, you can see that when Paul thinks about departing his current life and being with Christ, what he's talking about is at the day of Christ, and waiting for that day and his body being transformed to be like Jesus at that day.
What's come out of that small sort of deconstruction of the passage is that actually if you come into reading these passages with a whole load of baggage, you can pretty much support a number of different views, and it's a case of honestly kind of looking at the words, the other places that the kind of references are looked at, like when Jesus spoke to one of his amazing friends, Martha, and was talking about Lazarus, she was expecting a resurrection of her brother. She wasn't expecting like this kind of a soul detachment thing going on. She was expecting a resurrection, and he confirmed.
I know that in the last day.
In the last day. Which again links with this quote that you've taken from Philippians. Okay, so what do we take from that then? How do we move on from here?
Well, I think that's sort of got us to seeing that through both Hebrew and Greek, where it might appear as soul in English, the underlying meaning is much more to do with the whole person and their being as a physical person and their feelings, thoughts, emotions. Yes, that's all included in there. But that actually and we've just introduced it there by looking at some words of Paul in Philippians, the thing that was life after death was resurrection, involving the body being transformed. And that's very much what we get in the New Testament particularly. But I think it is helpful just to think about what resurrection is. The only person in history for whom that's happened is Jesus. And, according to the gospel accounts, he met with his disciples. He remembered them. He recognized them. He spoke to them about all of the things that had happened before he died. So he was essentially recreated as the person he was, but with immortality in Jesus' case, with everything that represented, that made him that person. So if you just think about what does God need in order to recreate a person?
Yeah. In terms of the physical being, and that is almost where you get a detachment of the physical being and the personality. In terms of what they need, he needs to understand what they were like as a person, I presume. That kind of how they behave, their faith, their convictions. Yeah, and their memories, their experiences, the things in their lives that had impacted them and changed them, as all of that is recreating. I don't think, as scientists, we're only just, not that we're scientists, but scientists are only just starting to understand what goes on in the brain when thoughts are formed and ideas are formed and memories are formed and so on. And what we're talking about here is recreating some person with all of that intact. And God, or Jesus, in order to raise someone from the dead, needs to have remembered that data, if you like, put it in modern terms, the data that makes that person, and recreate it. And, I think in some sense, I know that's a bit of a modern way of phrasing it, and that's not the frame of reference that Jesus was using. But when he says, don't fear those that can kill the body, but not the soul, essentially that is that. It's the person, who the person is, and God can remember it and recreate it. He made life, he made humanity in the first place. It's not so difficult to believe, if you can do that he can recreate a particular individual with all of that intact. That's a pretty amazing thought, really. It is, and there is a kind of a lo-fi equivalent of the data analogy used there, which in Revelation and other places it talks about a book which refers to events in people's lives, and that would have been the equivalent way of kind of putting that view forward. That idea of things that the person did were written down and therefore available for a judgment process. And a reconstruction process as well. And we can read that into what Paul meant when he said, for me, it's better to depart and be with Christ. Christ will stand by me and remember me, and he will, at the day of the appointed day, he will recreate him. Very good. Yeah. Okay. So, in terms of where we've got to there, I think we've fairly clearly established that it's difficult to substantiate the usual immortal soul type idea. And so how did it become such a pervasive and entrenched part of Christian culture and teaching?
That's a hard question to answer, I think, and it's probably one that is the subject of many PhD theses. But I think it's the short answer is it is the influence of that Greek philosophy as the Christian movement, the Christian communities spread through the Roman world. They were inevitably influenced by the Hellenistic thinking in the peoples to which they were spreading the gospel. And then after probably 300 or 400 years, you get to people like Tertullian, who are very clearly saying that the immortality of the soul is his view. And he talks about the immortality of the soul, for instance, is held by many. The knowledge of God is possessed by all. I will use, therefore, the opinion of Plato when asserting every soul is immortal. So he's quite open about saying, my proposal that souls are immortal is coming from Plato.
What kind of time was he?
He's in the 3rd century, I think.
So really close to the, when I say close in general history terms to when the apostles were teaching, actually, and spreading the gospel in the same regions like Athens. Seeing that really pervasive idea being a fundamental part of a lot of Christians' teaching and their, in their held beliefs. That really does kind of mean that we do need to take the approach of constantly checking what we believe, and it has implications on the way that we understand what our faith is.
I think there's probably a difference between what this general Christian concept of those things is and what Christian thinkers in more recent times have said. So there are loads of theologians over the centuries who have said, hang on, this immortal soul idea is not biblical. And I'm talking about people like Archbishop William Temple, the Archbishop of Canterbury in the 1940s, said that man is not immortal by nature. And he says, if men had not imported the Greek and unbiblical notion of the natural indestruction of the individual soul, and then come to the New Testament with that already in their minds, they would have drawn from it a belief not in everlasting torment, but in annihilation. So he's saying the problem is people have come to the Bible with that notion already in their minds. It's not biblical. It's unbiblical.
That's a really brave thing to say, isn't it? Was that a kind of one-off thing, or it
doesn't appear to be. I mean, there's another sort of a Wesleyan professor, a Methodist, Agar Beat, Dr. Beat, which is not some title,
Dr.
as far as I know.
Yeah. It should be. It should be definitely one.
But he wrote a book on the immortality of the soul, and the purpose of the book was to demonstrate that it's altogether alien from the Bible. It's not taught in the Bible. It's alien to the Bible in both phrase and thought, and derived only from Greek philosophy. So, and even in today, people like Tim Mackey of the Bible Project is saying this notion of the immortal soul is totally foreign to the Bible. He says it's not at all what nephesh meant in the biblical Hebrew. And Tom Wright, in his book Surprised by Hope, says just the same. And actually, I found on a Catholic website, the New Catholic Reporter, says Christianity does not teach, well, it says, to the surprise of some of its adherents, Christianity does not teach that each of us has an immortal soul. That, instead, is an old Greek idea, one which from time to time has weaseled its way into Christian thinking. When you start to look around for that, it's pretty clear that the voices across the Christian spectrum, if you like, are saying, this isn't from the Bible.
And it's almost like that's the academic view of that. Having looked at it, you can't really deny it. But it's what's in the minds of the cultural Christian, the kind of the non-academic Christian, isn't it? And so what's the implications of this for other topics? Really, what's the
Well, and I think we can start to see why this idea and sort of getting back to the biblical meaning of those words, nephesh and psyche, is a really big step, and maybe the start of a journey towards a biblical understanding of the gospel, and it has all sorts of implications. I mean, what if there is no immortal soul in that Platonic sense, then the idea that soul goes to heaven or hell in the common conception is also kind of, you pulled the rug from under that idea.
So then you've got other ideas about, okay, what replaces that, and where else do we see that? So we've already spoken about resurrection a little bit, and the kingdom, and the kingdom. That's a very, those are all things that are tied up with this life after death type concept. Yeah.
So where the kingdom is,
where is the kingdom?
Becomes a different sort of question, and even actually, I'd say, thinking about, well, obviously human nature, what does it mean to be a human being? And Jesus as well as a human being, the idea that, if the idea that there's an immortal part of a person that pre-existed and then was in their body for a while and then carried on afterwards, that sort of supports the idea of Jesus being the second person of the Trinity, complementary to that. But if that's not what those biblical words mean, then it has implications for how we think about Jesus as the Son of God, rather than God the Son. Yeah.
So how do you feel about smashing people's faith in this way, then, Paul?
This is and we'll try and turn it around from that point, I guess, before we finish. But it does start. It's a big thread that if you pull on, it starts to unravel all sorts of things that might have been constructed around a typical Christian theology. And as you start to do that, you might feel, the bottom's falling out of what I believe, and, no longer rely on it, be passionate about it. The thrill is gone in what you believe. But I would say that it is possible to put the pieces back together again. Look at those biblical words, think about those biblical ideas, and they actually come back together into what I think is a more complete, compelling, and fulfilling set of ideas that are inspiring and motivating.
Yeah, so I suppose if it's easy for us as non-theologically trained academics to quite easily pick one of these fundamental topics and to question it and to show strong evidence that it's not taught in the Bible, then essentially it's the analogy that Jesus uses about the house built on sand and a house built on rock. What you're saying is deconstruct that house built on sand and reconstruct it on that rock, which is the things that, we know that there were Christians in the first century who had a strongly held faith based on something. What was it? If it's not these things around soul, heaven and hell as we thought of it, or we grew up thinking of it, it's got to be something else. But it's in the Bible. It's there. It's discernible. It's just detaching it from the kind of cultural ideas you're coming to it with. Yeah. Well, I think we've probably used our allotted time here. So the question is, how many of the people who were listening all the way to the end of our podcast there managed to get all of the song titles? And I believe there was 4 that we managed to shoehorn in there. So Stand By Me was an obvious one. Ben E. King. Respect was my early attempt at trying to get a...
Got straight in there.
Yeah, Aretha Franklin, obviously. The Thrill Is Gone was one that you just got in towards the end there. Yes. B.B. King. And then Smokey Robinson and I Second That Emotion was a tremendously obvious and not a phrase that I generally use day to day. So, well, how many of you got all of those song titles? That's, if you didn't get anything else out of this podcast, maybe you've learnt some song titles for soul. So, thank you very much for listening to the Bible Feed podcast. As always, you can reach us on Facebook on our website, biblefeed.org. So please contact us there, join the conversation, give us some feedback on the things that you've heard on this podcast. Thank you.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the Bible Feed podcast. Thanks for joining us. We're always keen to hear what you think, hear your questions or subjects you'd like us to discuss. Get in touch with us on our Facebook page or send a message from our webpage at biblefeed.org and be part of the journey.